Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Thank you for joining us this evening for the next installment of our fall lecture series titled Entangled, Creatures, Critters, Companions, and Kin. Tonight's guest, Joseph Altshuler, is a multidisciplinary designer, educator, and curator. He's a co-founder of Could Be Design, and he's an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign School of Architecture. This year's series is themed around the messy entanglements between technology, culture, and nature. Joseph came to mind immediately. His first book, Creatures Are Stirring, A Guide to Architectural Companionship, prompts readers to develop more intimate friendships with our architectural companions and find empathy amongst humans, non-humans, buildings, interiors, and the broader environment. Joseph looks at how we can imagine architecture as an animate creature that abounds with personality, vibrant color, shapely form, and interpersonal intimacy. His work is playful, relatable, and immediately accessible. In one of his essays on animate architecture, he described, "Architectural characters are both humorous and serious at the same time, privileging serious fun and funny sincerity." His scholarship on serious play has always resonated for me, as it's my hope that our students can balance humor, liveliness, and sincerity in how they imagine the future for our built environments and communities. So if you could all join me in welcoming Joseph Altshuler.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you so much to the University of Tennessee, College of Architecture and Design. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be here and to spend the day exploring not only your campus and your facilities, but also like getting intimate with some studio work. I'm feeling inspired and filled with ideas that I want to bring back to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and also excited to see the kind of future trajectories of the student projects I got to take a little stroll through today. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. So today I hope to convince you all that indeed architecture is alive, and actually really that everything is alive, and that we should be really that we should take pleasure in the ways that architecture fits into a worldview that imagines everything alive and not just what your biology high school textbooks say is alive. And we'll get into that and why I think that's important. And this evening, I am going to kind of do a little tracing and trekking through some of my practices projects, which alongside my sort of scholarship and writing are trying to make a case for the liveliness of architecture in the world and what that can do for our human and non-human communities. This, just as a little backstory on this image, which was also generously featured on your posters. Kudos to the poster designer, by the way. Who does the posters? Is anyone here the poster designer for the lecture series events? Go Maggie. I appreciate the poster design. I think that in my practice Could Be Design, and let me also say as an overall attribution, my practice is a partnership with my partner, Zach Morrison, and so all of the work that you'll see tonight was very much conceived in close collaboration with Zach, as well as, depending on the project, we love to collaborate, teams of other collaborators. So shout out to collaborators. This project, which was on your poster, so I felt like I had to start with it just because it was on your poster, was a project we were commissioned by the city of Chicago. They were doing, this is early COVID, and they were doing billboards in the city of Chicago to encourage people to get vaccinated. And they commissioned us to make one, and they told us there could be the only rule was there can be no needles on the poster. I'm like, all right, we're good with that, no needles. So this is our, we call this the vaccination party. So this is after all the buildings get vaccinated. They actually get to start hanging out together again in the city. But I think beyond like being a kind of image, a kind of effort at making an image that would be around the city that would celebrate not only, I think our goal was to think about how we could celebrate togetherness as something that is beyond just humans, but that our built environment is implicated in. And in turn, I feel like this model, this party of Chicago buildings alongside people who have a slightly strange scale relative to them that are also inside a kind of weird interior is emblematic of some of our approaches to practice, which are all about thinking about how the liveliness of the built environment can enable and empower new forms of companionship. And that's companionship among humans and humans. That's companionship among humans and, I'll say buildings, but components of the broader built environment. And maybe I think the part that makes people the most uncomfortable, companionship actually between buildings and buildings, or between components of the built environment and other components of the built environment. And our practice is trying to think about, to use, I guess, the language of your lecture series, the entanglements of all three types of those vectors of relationships, and how our world can be a less violent, more liberated, and loving place if we pay really close attention to those three types of relationships at the same time. So kind of reflecting on some of our recent practice, I'm going to offer, I guess, I know this isn't a good architectural number, but like 4, not 5 points around how architectural companionship plays out in our practice in an attempt to kind of unpack and reflect on some kind of recent themes in our work. And what I hope can also be potentially useful for some of you as well. So I will start with number 1, which is intimate inglenooks. And in all of these tactics, I think, again, we're interested in these different directionalities of relationships that are possible between people and people, people and architecture, architecture and people, and that often requires a kind of reciprocity. So on one hand, I think it's easy for many of us who are schooled in a kind of Western tradition that would have us believe that oftentimes that architecture is a tool that is helping solve problems in the world, a tool that is helping keep us dry and warm, a tool that is helping us create spaces for our communities. I think we equally want to think of it as something that we're capable of forming a relationship with that's not about solving any kind of problem, but it's just about exploring the gradations of identity and emotion among us. And in that sense, all of these are kind of framed with some kind of reciprocal statement. So you can hug your architecture, but what does it mean to let your architecture hug you back? Intimate inglenooks is really about thinking about the scale, the intimate sort of scale between the human body and the built environment, and trying to amplify moments where we really encounter a spatial moment, and in turn, when spatial moments encounter us. And that often happens through kind of very small scale, body scaled work, but it also can happen in the bigger, broader world of public space. So to jump into a project, this is, name the architect? Not a trick question, but anyone recognize this old friend of ours? Mies van der Rohe. This is one of 3 single-family homes designed by Mies van der Rohe in the United States. Of course, and 2 of them are in Illinois, which is my home state. Of course, the much more famous older sister of this house is the Farnsworth house, which you're, I'm sure, all familiar with. This one's slightly less, this is like the less glamorous sibling of the Farnsworth house. This is the McCormick house. It's, it's a little less fancy. It's, it's not on stilts. It doesn't have, from a modernist standpoint, it's got a few funny things going on, which is all the more reason I love it. This is the original floor plan of the drawing of the house. And I think maybe unlike the Farnsworth house, which, as many of you probably know, there were lots of sort of issues that Dr. Edith Farnsworth had with the house and also with the kind of commission with Mies. This one, the family that lived there actually, like, as far as I understand, was pretty comfortable there. And there were, I think, a few key floor plan design attributes that made family life maybe more tenable here than maybe in some other Misesian modern environments. Most notably, I think, just like a larger presence of floor-to-ceiling walls and wall partitions. Maybe less of a pure modernist idea, but definitely something that I think accommodated the intimacy and messiness of everyday family life. The funny thing about this floor plan is like there's basically like one strand for the kids and one strand for the adults. This is very much kind of enforcing a kind of domestic power play of separating adult life and kid life. There's a lot of weird things in the floor plan, actually. And the two halves just kiss at this very tiny moment near the kitchen. I think it also was like probably the kids and the babysitter or nanny lived on that half. And this house was, again, lived in very comfortably for many years. In the 90s, it was purchased by the Elmhurst Art Museum. Has anyone been to this building? Anybody? Field trip time. And when the museum bought the building, the first thing they did was they took out most of the walls, which was, I think, for me, the very thing that made this, I think, a kind of unusual but also functional and loved and companionable kind of piece of architecture. They removed all the walls, of course, to make it more of like a gallery space, like many other kind of Misesian spaces. And when my practice was invited to do an interior architecture intervention in this house, we were interested in kind of reinscribing some of the walls that were removed. So what you're seeing here in this palimpsest is the original drawing by Mies. The black lines are when many of the walls were removed by the museum to make it a gallery space. And then the pink lines are our attempt at actually reinscribing many, although not quite all, of the walls that were removed to kind of restage, or let's say reenact, some of the domestic spaces. And part of our approach to this project was also utilizing specifically curtains, which is a nod to Lily Reich, Mies's longtime collaborator, as a way of kind of reinscribing those rooms, and specifically also designing some custom furniture pieces, furnishings in the broader sense, that while they don't look anything like kind of the original mid-century modern furniture that inhabited this space, are meant to reenact the programmatic kind of areas of the house, such that in a sort of weird effort of preservation, that visitors to this space can kind of re-experience some of the domestic activities. This is the living room and our sort of interpretation of a couch that might have taken place here. And all of these furniture items also sort of straddle walls. So while the walls existed and they were removed, we're also thinking about how furniture items can actually challenge the neat demarcations of space through these intimate inglenooks, these sort of really intimate moments where you can get up close and personal, not only with your fellow humans, but with the house. You can play chess in the former parlor. We kind of reenacted sort of the strange galley kitchen, and we filled the kitchen fixtures with candy that people could take. The playroom, the children's playroom, becomes a puppet theater in our reinterpretation, and you can even lie down and take a nap in the bedroom. And I think the effort here was to really think about, again, interacting with a piece of important historic architecture in a way that is intimate and also participatory and companionable. That this house, maybe now it's like part of this like preservation project of the museum, but it's a kind of living being that also remembers and has a memory of the domesticity that once took place there, and that we can participate in that as visitors today. I'm hoping Mies wouldn't like these colors. A kind of another project in this realm of interior architecture. Who's an interior architecture student here today? All in the back row. It's big. It's this nice section. Like, go interior architects. That's not. You guys stick together back there. How come the interior architects sit in the back row? That's cool. This is another interior architecture project. And this is a project at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In this project, we were given a really weird aspect ratio of a space to think about interior architecture. The dimensions of the space we are given were, if I'm remembering this right, 40 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, and 6 feet tall. So it's a weird dimension. And this was a space that I think had historically been used essentially as a kind of display case for the school, where people would display drawings and maybe occasionally sit models in that 2.5 foot deep sort of shelf space. But it was never a space that we had ever seen anyone inhabit as an interior, as a piece of interior architecture. And so as we were thinking about this like weird aspect ratio, we were trying to think of examples kind of from the history of museums and exhibits and also in art and graphic design of when shallow spaces, 2.5 feet is pretty shallow, but 40 feet is really wide. Like trying to think of examples of when shallow spaces become more immersive with life specifically. And we of course like immediately started thinking about like the dioramas of natural histories museums as a kind of really amazing example of how you can have a really shallow space, but through the combination of a three-dimensional figure, i.e. taxidermy, and a sort of painted backdrop, or a graphic as a backdrop, you create the sensation of a more immersive world, a more inhabitable world, a space as opposed to just a display. And we were also, I don't remember exactly why now, but we were also thinking about the kind of specifically the French tradition of caricature as a kind of graphic design-oriented kind of diorama, again, with the presence of life and the kind of relationship of shadows specifically, the important role of shadows in caricature, of not only producing a depth of the scene, but actually producing an additional layer of narrative, often to, of course, satirize or make fun of political figures, where the shadows don't always tell the truth exactly, or maybe they tell a deeper truth than the thing that they're being cast from. And so this is our kind of interior architectural interpretation of some of these influences. Again, thinking about the kind of relationship between 3D figures, animate figures from our sketchbooks, and sort of painted shadows to create a kind of inhabitable space in a weird aspect ratio, and one that we were specifically hoping to invite people to inhabit and participate in, unlike, let's say, the diorama of the Natural History Museum, rather a space where you yourself as a visitor can become part of the scene, not just something to gaze at, but something to actually jump in and enter and participate in different ways. And this space happened to be along a kind of main thoroughfare, a corridor in the school. And so rarely would you, if you got off the elevator, this was the view you saw, but most of the time you were actually walking more oblique to it, kind of left or right. And so you wouldn't see it so frontally or elevationally. And so the objective was to think about how we could take figuration as a kind of architectural practice and take advantage or exploit the opportunity that people would be approaching it from different oblique angles, such that if you approached it at a different angle or from a different direction, actually different figures in this sort of inhabitable diorama would actually snap into and out of sort of your optical vantage point, but also your kind of seduce you in inhabitable ways. And over the course of this thing's life, it started to become a sort of informal hangout place in the school, a place where kind of nooks and crannies, intimate ingle nooks could be kind of inhabited for different kinds of small group conversations and discussions. And again, essentially making humans a little bit more commingled with architecture in the process to become part of this scene. And I think my favorite moment of all is like when people actually start sort of snuggling with it. And this is not like soft and cuddly, but as soon as somebody starts hugging architecture, the architecture might start hugging you back. So that was a moment of joy for myself and for this strange little world. So like shifting gears, I'll try to do like about 3 projects for each of these tactics. I don't want anyone to fall asleep. So one last one for intimate ingle nooks, and then we'll switch gears. And this is like a little bit more of a moving outside of the realm of sort of art practice and installation practice, though still, I think, very much interior architecture. So go interior architecture students back there. This is more of a sort of client-driven residential project. This was a 2-unit building, a kind of gut rehab in Chicago's McKinley Park neighborhood, if anybody knows that neighborhood. And what's so weird about the really weird floor plan, this weird trapezoid. I love weird weird context, so fun. Weird aspect ratios, weird shapes. That's what makes, for me, architecture really fun. And if anyone knows this part of the city, there is a shipping canal and an expressway, the Stevenson Expressway, Interstate 55, that goes southwest from the city center and disrupts the neat rectilinear nature of the grid. And so you get these like weird lots that have these sort of trapezoidal edges as a result of that sort of diagonal infrastructure that's disrupting kind of the city grid. And you get these weird floor plans, and this is the demo plan actually. And you get no wall was like at the same angle. It's kind of actually, from like a circus standpoint, kind of fun. You go in, you get really dizzy, and you have no sense of bearings. But the client wanted to create, they wanted to keep it a 2-unit building, and they wanted to make one unit a sort of micro housing unit for herself, and the other unit was meant to be a residency, an artist residency for artists. She was an arts organizer, and she wanted to create a residential unit for artists as a sort of retreat and residency space to come and relax and to maybe produce work, but more often to like sort of engage the public in small, intimate ways in the context of a house. So to think about a small residential unit actually as also a kind of public space for different kinds of programs and events that would happen essentially in the living room of this residential unit. And the total square footage of this trapezoid is about 1,100 square feet. So it's pretty tight. And there's weird shapes. This is the floor plan we came up with. We did, I'm sad to say, straighten out a few of the walls in the interest of trying to fit some things in. But one of our design approaches to kind of really deal with the kind of weird geometry of the space was to turn to sort of custom built-in furniture and millwork as an opportunity to really occupy the footprint in an intentional, efficient might be an overstatement, but to occupy it in a really intentional way such that we wouldn't be like pulling in generic furniture that wouldn't fit right in these weird corners, and that it could start to actually accommodate the really ambitious ideas for like bringing in groups into this very, very modest footprint. And the result is something like this. This is the space. Again, I think at the most narrow end of this living room, it's just like cuts down to like 4 feet, but then it spans open to closer to maybe 10 to 11 feet. So it's tight, but you can fit a nice crowd in here for different kinds of artist talks and events. And the sort of, we also raise the ceiling. It's just a 1-story building, but the sort of ceiling becomes a kind of gallery space for the different artists that kind of leave their work as a kind of trace of their time in this residency. It's kind of datum along the upper part of the wall and the ceiling. A couple other views. And I think for us, like really thinking about how, especially with such a small footprint, to be really kind of strategic about built-ins, things that sort of pop in and out of existence, so that this can become a functional study but then disappear and become a sort of library for entertaining the guests, and that this is another kind of liveliness for a building that's always kind of flickering between different uses for both sort of private and public purposes. And of course, I think for us also an affinity for shape and color as a way to celebrate some of the weirdness and some of the delights of this space, and to create, while still creating partitions between the different kind of domestic spaces, windows and viewpoints and apertures that frame others. And this is the outside, weird existing facade too. Such a weird building. Part of the ambition of the project also was, while we really kept the exterior shell as found, of course, repainting and adding some kind of graphic language for the kind of identity of the 2 units, was thinking about how this very small residence also starts to activate its streetscape. And so the design included also a kind of landscape strategy of kind of rewilding the parkway between the house and the street with kind of native prairie grasses, as well as kind of animating that streetscape and landscape with a free little seed library. And the sort of owner-client of this is very keen on urban agriculture as kind of part of her endeavor, and giving back to the neighborhood through a kind of annual seasonal kind of storage of seeds that people could take, just like in the sort of spirit of a free little library, and kind of curating a little festival around that each spring. All right, tactic number 2 is haptic happenings. So haptic happenings, I think, again, thinking about the different gradations of how the built environment is alive, is really about, I think, other senses beyond the visual, to really activate a full gradation of senses involved in the built environment, and thinking about different ways that plays out through form, through program, and through different kinds of event. This is another COVID project. We call this Billboard Buddies. We were commissioned by an art school who wanted to continue their program of cultural happenings and exhibitions, but it was, at the time, this was early COVID, it was not possible to do that inside. This was the School of Art at the Indiana University Northwest campus, which is in Gary, Indiana. If anyone's ever been to Gary, Indiana. Home of Michael Jackson and Music Man songs. It turns out there's a lot of parking lots in Gary, Indiana at this time. Gary, Indiana is a city it's had a rough go of it. It's got a lot of serious issues. It has a lot of underutilized spaces. It has a lot of parking lots. So the kind of objective was, how can we actually transform parking lots into cultural spaces? And how can we be really nimble for the School of the Art to create an infrastructure for displaying content, but also to create enough personality and iconicity for the infrastructure itself, such that even the exhibit infrastructure has a kind of liveliness that people recognize and can have a relationship with, especially in the kind of anonymous or seemingly anonymous space of a parking lot. And so we kind of invented this sort of kit-apart system of little kiosks that have interchangeable pieces that the school could set up and deploy in different ways depending on the curatorial direction of a show. We gave them names. I think naming is one of a sort of series of tactics we like to use to amplify the personality and liveliness of architectural parts. And the result was something like this. And this thing kind of went on tour through a whole variety of different spaces and municipalities around Northwest Indiana, with different kind of guest curators that the kind of school selected. Sometimes they became little selfie stations. Sometimes they became really a kind of exhibit boards. Other times they became sort of cabinets of curiosities that would open up. And again, that gave some flexibility to how there were some sort of self-similar parts that could be interchanged. And eventually, as like kind of the situation, as COVID continued to progress, these things started to move inside once that became tenable. And today they kind of live more in interior galleries to give a sort of pop of punctuation and I would say salutation to some of the exhibit spaces that this school works with. So at a very different scale, and I was talking to a couple of faculty members about this last night, another project in this category is an architecture festival that we started last year in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood. This is called the Chicago Sukkah Design Festival. And this is a project that keeps me up at night because of the number of moving parts, and is probably subject to a separate lecture later, but I'll give you just a little taste of it in the context of this. But the premise of this festival is multifold, but I think at its core, the most important part about this festival is that thinking about the format of exhibitions, biennials, like there's such a big sort of biennial culture. The Chicago Architecture Biennial is about to open this week. And we wanted to really think about how that format of sort of putting on a show could actually have a stronger impact on the communities in which it takes place. And not something that like swoops in, makes a cool thing, swoops out. Okay, there's a lot of resources, both in material and money, that goes into these kinds of shows. And so this was an experiment to see how we could shift the delivery modality of festivals, exhibitions, biennials in a different way that would produce a longer term relationship with a neighborhood and with community groups. And so the premise is, in this festival, that we play matchmaker and we pair up architects from around Chicago with community organizations in the North Lawndale neighborhood, which is on Chicago's west side, an amazing, vibrant neighborhood, but also a neighborhood like many neighborhoods on the west side and south side that have been historically disinvested in over time and that have been subject to all kinds of forms of systemic racism. And the idea would be that the community organization determines a kind of program need that they have. and that the designers would create a small pavilion, a sukkah, which is part of a Jewish harvest holiday, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second, but would create this sort of temporary structure that would both create a festive and lively opportunity for a festival, but then immediately after the festival, it would be deassembled, relocated, and reinstalled at the headquarters of the community organization to serve a purpose. And in so doing, the sort of funding and momentum that goes into producing a festival event or biennial could actually be channeled to a much more long-term or permanent enactment in the neighborhood. And just like, it was a really quick backstory. The North Lawndale neighborhood was historically a Jewish neighborhood. It was the center of the Jewish community in the early part of the 20th century. I happen to be a Jewish architect, and my grandparents grew up in this neighborhood. Many Jewish families left this neighborhood in the 60s and 70s. Today, it is a predominantly black neighborhood. And there was a moment, actually, during that migration when there was like a kind of true sort of coalition between specifically in this case, the Jewish and the black neighborhood around the civil rights movement in the 60s. And so part of the effort of this festival is to use this Jewish architectural custom, the construction of these temporary outdoor huts called sukkahs, as a sort of vehicle or platform for sort of re-engaging that history of building solidarity among not only the Jewish and the black communities, but also the many cultures that call this area home today. And in so doing, actually try out a new paradigm for festivals and biennials. So this was, we launched a pilot version of this last year. This is some of the results of that. There was one that became a farm stand for what community farmers market. The sort of purple one off the left edge there became a sort of heritage space for a church that was the one church that gave Martin Luther King a sort of pulpit to speak during his residency in Chicago, a place to speak, a kind of museum space. And a third one became a kind of book nook or literacy space for an after-school program. So these all got relocated. Actually, two of them got relocated immediately after and reprogrammed. And you can see some of the activation days and festival here. And then this year we did a second edition of this. This is the dangerous part of this was initially a kind of self-initiated project. We went to some neighborhood partners. We're like, yeah, I have a weird idea. What do you think? Should we do this? And then they said, well, let's do it every year. And we're like, uh-oh. So now we have to figure out what that means for our practice. But we did the second edition of this festival just a couple weeks ago, and we expanded the footprint to 6 different community organizations and 6 different designers and groups. And we had to start to contend with now for the second year, starting to think about some of the more long-term livelihood of this site and to make some more permanent infrastructure improvements, including this sort of accessible path and seating. You can see kind of the relationship to the city. And really thinking about this landscape is something that's not just supporting a festival, but that is actually starting to support a more year-round series of community activities on this site. So here's some of the kind of permanent street seating and infrastructure and signage that's been installed. After this sort of success of the pilot festival, they actually named this space the Freedom Square. And so trying to kind of support that. You can see some of the results. All right, we've made it to tactic number 3, and you're still awake, which is good. This one is especially for, I love the makeup of this college. It's all my favorite things. This is for the graphic designers in the room. Any graphic designers here tonight? Yes. Not many, but it's the cool kids, I think. This is gregarious graphics. One of the reasons I wanted to become an architect in the first place is I've always thought that the built environment that I am most familiar with is not colorful enough. And so I've always been really interested in the kind of relationship between color and graphics in the built environment. I joke, but I'm also serious. I kind of wish I was a graphic designer, but I went a different route. But I'm really interested, and I really believe in the agency of graphics in architectural production. Or that is to say, I think that graphics, and I think your college is well poised to position this too, but I really believe that architecture can be delivered through graphics. Or that is to say, graphics can produce space as opposed to information, which I think graphics is traditionally allocated towards. And some of these projects speak to that and speak to the ways that graphics are an accessible route through which we can start to animate and understand the liveliness of the built environment. So heading a quick trick back to Gary, Indiana. I know you're all eager to get back there. This is a project called Gary Goyles. And this is a project with the city of Gary and also their public transportation network. I mentioned that Gary is a struggling city. One of the things the city lacks is just basic crosswalk infrastructure. They just don't have markings on the street to show you, to show you where the crosswalk is, which may seem really mundane and banal, but is actually a really important thing, especially along busy streets where motorists need extra visibility to know that it's a place where there will be pedestrians. So it may sound banal, but this project was quite simply to create crosswalk infrastructure throughout the city, and specifically to connect a kind of network of places along key intersections that are near bus stops, so where there'll be a particular foot traffic of pedestrians, and to make that more visible. And to think about that in a way that doesn't just have to be white stripes, but something that can also start to lend a kind of graphic identity to a city, and something that might appear and disappear in all different parts of downtown Gary. We had kind of invented this narrative with a series of community groups, which we called Gary Goyles, which are these little creatures that wander around the sidewalks that escaped from the steel mills and are helping pedestrians find their way between kind of street crossings and bus stops. And it's this sort of kind of language of course, kind of specific geometry and colors, much of which come from some of the sort of the civic center. I actually should get a photo of that in the slideshow, but there's a kind of civic center in the center of Gary where many of these geometries were kind of extracted from, and of course, slightly irreverently played with by us to make these creatures. And we hope, we think of this, again, like it's a pretty modest project, but I think, again, it starts to speak to how graphics are a lot more than information, but can start to, even in small ways, build narratives that directly connect to infrastructure. And we hope to expand this project in a lot of other ways, but for now, it lives as a crosswalk. So in that sense, graphics really operate 2D. I think graphics can also operate 3-dimensionally as well. So to continue our creaturely narrative, this is a recent project that we completed at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We call it the Animate Arcade. This project it's in a kind of fancy building. It's a building for the Siebel Center for Design, a design institute on the University of Illinois campus. It's shiny and new. It opened in 2021. When it opened, the director of the building immediately was sort of dissatisfied with sort of the programmatic use of many of the public spaces. It features a kind of super open plan, universal space, kind of anything can happen, but also nothing can happen in some ways because of sort of the lack of sort of landmarks and specificity around programming. So the goal of this project, when they approached us, was really about populating the interior of the public spaces of the building with, let's say, architectural interventions that are slightly, in some cases, slightly bigger than rooms, or sometimes slightly smaller than rooms, but a lot bigger than furniture, that start to create, again, landmarks, nodes, edges, and thresholds that have a kind of graphic presence as much as a kind of spatial one. So one element is this gateway element that frames a view into where they sometimes have sort of informal talks and events, but that also kind of greets you when you enter the building from one side, and that sort of extends its hand at you. These forms are, really intentionally meant to be animate in the broadest sense, but not indicative of any specific animal. Or that is to say, they may have appendages, they may have snouts, they may have outstretched limbs and eyes as apertures, but they're not meant to replicate any specific known reference. And we hope they are meant to kind of invite alternative readings and interpretations depending on the direction that you approach them, and in so doing to induce you to rotate around them in the round, or to kind of revisit them under different lighting and different moods. So there's a welcome desk, sort of concierge desk for the center. This is the sort of gateway leading down to a mobile backdrop for different size events and programs. And then there's this kind of roving kiosk that, and this was just on opening day, but that now is meant to be pinned up on top of and kind of plastered with student posters and pinned into with different kinds of content. I think this project also speaks to a broader interest we have in using, I would say, really conventional materials in slightly unconventional ways. Taking your everyday OSB board and tinting it towards raspberry sorbet. Trying to think about the most off-the-shelf materials that operate in different ways. And we got some sound. We worked with and produced some film about this series to kind of introduce it to the world. We were lucky enough to win the Architectural League Prize. And so as part of our, from the Architectural League of New York, as part of our League Prize, we worked with some filmmakers and we told some other stories with these creatures. So this is one of 3 one-minute films that we produced. And if you're interested in the other ones, you can check them out on the Architecture League of New York's website. But I think, more importantly, I think they speak to a broader interest we have in experimenting with other modes of cultural production to try to sort of tell the story of the sort of fictional lives of our buildings, but also our own fictional lives as humans around our buildings. Another quick project in the realm of gregarious graphics. This is a project for a brewery in Chicago's Albany Park neighborhood. There's an existing building, but it's really not about the exterior. It's a Twisted Hippo is the brewery, but it's really about the interior. This building was formerly a auto shop warehouse kind of garage space. Maybe not so atypical for a kind of cavernous brewery situation. But our goal was really to create more intimate, more specific, and more companionable sort of zones and spaces within that broad interior. And of course, small budget, as often is the case. And I think, graphics is yet another way, both in terms of cost, but in terms of application, is a kind of accessible way of making space, and making space with color, specificity, and verve, and making space that has both kind of organizational as well as atmospheric effects. So this is a project, literally we're making stencils. It's pretty low tech. We're a pretty low tech approach here, but painting graphics on the ground with stencils and then sealing it onto the epoxy floor. And this is the result. So occasionally the graphics sort of double as sort of informational wayfinding, leading you to the important place to order your libation, and other times they are more kind of delineators of different zones and areas in the brewery. I think importantly, also sometimes they extrude into 3 dimensions, these graphics, and start to perform in other ways, in this case as a kind of acoustic cloud that generates a space over the stage for open mic nights and poetry readings. And that actually creates a spot where you can also sit along the banquette to have an audible conversation, even in an otherwise sort of cavernous and acoustically questionable space. Sometimes the graphics, we couldn't help ourselves, and a little carbonation effervescing off of where they brew the beer. And other times they kind of lock into the furniture or the bathroom wallpaper, as the case may be. All right, we made it to number 4, lively locomotion. So I think this strand, and this is the strand I think we've been experimenting with most lately, this is about literally untethering architecture, interior architecture, landscape architecture, graphic design, and letting your architecture shift your world's vantage points. I think that one of the most, getting back to like the sort of biology textbook observation, one of the like, I think, key signs of life from our biology textbook is the capacity to locomote, the capacity for a body to propel itself around this earth, which is something that architecture typically doesn't do. Or at least it doesn't typically visibly do that. I think certainly in the history of Western architecture, we privilege the permanence, the stability, structurally and otherwise, the material and cultural and structural stability of buildings. But in reality, buildings are moving around all the time in small and in flickering ways, as well as major ways, in terms of operable windows and doors, in terms of environmental systems, in terms of the evolution of materials and degradation. Like, buildings are constantly moving, even though that's not always the image that an architect likes to portray of their building. And we think it's sometimes one of the liveliest ones of all. That's not to say that all buildings should get up and start walking around, although, you know, every now and then that might be cool. But that is to say, I think we can think about other sort of kinetic and locomotive approaches to how the built environment and our landscapes work that can start to create other possibilities for not only recognizing the built environment as alive, but again, creating the different types of companionships between people, architecture, and architecture, and architecture. This was like a little early project in our practice where a student design journal, is there a student design journal here? Not yet. A student design journal asked us to make 5 interpretations of seesaws. So that was awesome. Seesaws are like the quintessential, in some ways, locomotive architecture. There are, you know, an architecture that demands participation in order to be pleasurable, and you know, perfectly kind of addresses the limitations of gravity to produce joy. And so much so that, like, you know, this sign actually stands in for playgrounds. The seesaw is not just a seesaw, but it's an emblem or synecdoche of the act of play itself. So we were excited about that. And so we made a series of seesaws that all have some kind of specific relationship to each other and the people. So this is, I don't remember the names of these. This is Peekaboo Priscilla. This is a seesaw for on-again, off-again relationships where as you go, you alternately see or don't see your partner in the process. And this is Sideways Seymour. This is a seesaw for introverts. We love introverts too. So you don't have to have a human partner to engage in a joyful relationship with architecture. This is Rebound Rodney for multitaskers. You can seesaw and practice your hoop game at the same time. And this is Thermal Thelma. This is part seesaw, part spa, hot tub, or as we like to say, a sea spa. Swimsuits are optional. And I think, like, for us, one of the ways that we're interested in pushing or exploring the possibilities for how architecture works is also just through interrogating the modes of representation that are most close at hand. Or that is to say, most of the time when we make drawings, and that might not, this college might be proving me otherwise, so maybe most is an overstatement, but many times when architects make drawings, they tend to be fixed. They tend to be stationary drawings that are either fixed in pigment or in pixels. And oftentimes when we make physical models, they tend to be stationary and they tend to sit on top of pedestals, which is actually my least favorite place to see a model. And so I think part of our research around this area is really testing modes of architectural representation that can actually prompt other ways of thinking about locomotion. Or a more simple way of saying that is to say, we should make drawings that are in motion, we should make models that are in motion. And how do we test the different ways of doing that? Even if we're not literally saying that something we're designing is moving around the world, the act of allowing representation that allows for moving parts can enable new ways of seeing its impact. So one way we do that is through we call it, I guess, architectural puppets. I don't know if these really count as puppets or not. But these are just really simple physical models that we are animating live. And so one of the things we're interested in is like stop motion animation has been, I think, an entry point for us into this. But I'm particularly interested in the possibilities of live performance of architecture. And this is an early experiment. So again, stop motion animations are pretty cool, but I'm interested in the possibility of how actually a live performance of, I guess there was a little bit of stop motion at the very end there, but for the most part, that was a fully live performance that was recorded. We were under the table with magnets, moving those guys around and recording it live. I think there's something about the way we engage with audiences that live performance is particularly good at. And I think this is something we can learn from our friends in the performing arts, that architecture tends to be less good at, is how we build audiences, how we engage audiences actually through the process of performance. And this is maybe an exaggerated example of that, in that it's literally a sort of puppet show in a theatrical sense. But I think there's ways that we're hoping that that will inform also more conventional ways that we build architectural models and drawings, that we can perform them live in the world as opposed to just like stick them on a pedestal as an inert object, but something that can start to produce an audience response in the process. And we hope maybe even a little humor or like some other kinds of reactions along the way too, that there is also a kind of course, imperfection and risk that is part of the process of live performance that I think sometimes we're scared of and that we're interested in. I'm gonna show one last project and then we'll open this up for questions. This is our most recent project and our first kind of more full-scale experiment with locomotion in the built environment. This is the Carousel for Companionship. This is a project that was part of the most recent cycle of Exhibit Columbus over in Columbus, Indiana. Their biennial that engages with the modernist legacy of that strange and wonderful city. And our approach was to create, let's say it's one part play structure, one part public art, one part stage for performances, and one part viewing machine for the city, a kind of rotating platform that has a very tight relationship to a super graphic installation on the walls that flank it, that start to sink into and out of alignment with different forms. And all of these geometries and forms closely reference buildings that that you can spot in the city of Columbus, some famous, some not so famous, but that this starts to become a sort of mixtape of buildings in Columbus through architectural form, through architectural motion, thinking about the sort of silhouettes of kind of important buildings around the area, many of which are actually in eyesight of this site, that sort of huddle together on the site like a group of friends and form this rotating platform. This is along 4th Street, if anyone knows Columbus, and 4th Street is sometimes closed for community events. And so part of the idea is that the platform can rotate towards the street and be more extroverted when there's a big event or market days, farmers market thing happening, or it can rotate inward towards this sort of strange little plaza that we found and facilitate more intimate performances and play. This is the existing site. We were like invited to pick our own site, which honestly is like the worst thing ever. When people invite you to pick their own site, it's so hard. There's so many cool sites. But we were drawn to this one because of, it felt like there were like sleeping shapes here, like this a cascading parapet, a triangular soffit, a rounded corner. It was like, it's like one of those games you play with your kids where it's like, how many shapes do you see in this picture? And there's infinite answers. And it was just like calling us to bring it to life. And so this is the result. And this will be part of, there's a sort of temporary aspect to it, but also kind of permanent infrastructural changes to the site for different kinds of events, through these kind of movable benches and planters and mural. And for anyone who knows Columbus, that Alexander Gerard has a kind of really big impact on the kind of modernist legacy of that city. And so we were kind of riffing on some colors and patterns from his playbook, and also like bringing the community in as a kind of integral participant in the making of this thing. And ultimately, the most challenging part of the project, and honestly the part that we didn't quite get right yet, but everything is a kind of work in progress, is the actual rotation of the object itself, which we were working with the constraint is that the city told us like it can't be too fast because there's a lot of bars around here, and after hours there's going to be drunk people that are going to do stupid shit here, and you're going to have to either lock it at night, or it can't go too fast, which I had never really thought about in the context of like specifying materials and really thinking about the kind of technical makeup of this thing. So we had to make it hard enough we were absolutely dead set that we would absolutely not want this thing locked. That was completely an anathema to kind of our ambition for this project. And so we had to make it difficult enough to rotate that the city would okay it not being locked, but still possible enough to rotate that people would be invited and encouraged to use it. And the goal was to design it so one person alone couldn't rotate it, but you have to bring a friend. And you have to have two people to work on it together in order for it to rotate. And the city was okay with that, so they signed off on that. And again, it also becomes this kind of viewing device for the city. But I guess just to pick up on that thought, I think the part that we didn't quite get right, and I was talking to Julie about this earlier, is because it's difficult enough that you need two people to make it rotate and play. If you don't necessarily know that, then a single person comes up to it and tries to rotate it, can't do it, and gives up and goes away, which that's I think where we failed on this. But we need to make more obvious permission that go get a friend to help you. Don't worry, you can do it. You gotta put your muscle into it. But adults had trouble with that, but we quickly realized that the kids knew exactly what to do. And even though we saw a lot of adults come up to it, try to push it, give up, the kids they know what to do. They got their friends and they got it moving. So that was good. So I was going to talk a little bit about my book, but I think the work and the practice really exemplifies the projects of the book. I mean, in one sentence, I would say the book tries to convince you that architecture is alive, and it does that through three different modes of scholarship and creative work. One is through fiction, and there's three myths or memoirs about the built environment, past, present, and future, that feature lively buildings, in this case from the past. And it sort of weaves together academic essays about sort of buildings that either have looked like creatures throughout the history of architecture, or buildings that act like creatures or that present unexpected creaturely qualities. And ultimately, how thinking about the point of this book is not that all buildings should look like creatures, but rather that if buildings that do look like creatures, or buildings that do behave like creatures, or buildings that do make us more aware of our own creatureliness as humans, can actually change the way we have a relationship with architecture. And we can unlearn some of the things that we learn in adulthood about how, your stuffed animal is not alive anymore when you're 7 years old, which breaks my heart because I have an 8-year-old. But that actually it's okay to actually think about things that may be abiotic, but that we can have relationships with as if they were other biotic beings, architecture included. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming. And I'm happy to take a few questions. Yes.
I'm curious as to your ideas behind style, and if a lot of your work is obviously built upon these bright color blocks and the ethos of the radius. So I'm wondering if that's a response to your if that's kind of like a side thing where you see that there's not enough sort of color in the world and you want to help with that, or if you and then so that basically there could be architecture that's playful, that's rigid and colorless, and there could be architecture that's too serious, that's colorful and rounded, or if that's a way that you're inviting people into what you're trying to do.
I love that question. So first, yes, I think first to the second part of your question, if architecture, what did you say? Colorless and, what did you say? Colorless and yeah. Architecture that's rigid and colorless can be just as alive as architecture that's colorful and soft. Absolutely. And in fact, that is ultimately the sort of conclusion of the book. Like, I think certainly we have some aesthetic affinities and sort of stylistic qualities that we're interested in, like on a formal level, that we're interested in kind of bringing into the world. But I think for us, it's more about how the let's say the sort of the high contrast that sometimes our projects yield relative to their context. And all of our projects are cited in the messiness of the world. We generally don't do projects in white box galleries. We don't do projects that are like tabula rasa kinds of construction. We do projects that are entangled in the messiness of the world. And so oftentimes the bright colors, the rounded corners, the sort of, let's say, occasionally a kind of cartoonish quality is meant to be a way of exaggerating and calling attention to the fact that we're trying to untrain this idea that architecture is stationary and inert and stable, but not that that's required to make architecture lively, not at all. Does that answer your question? Sometimes you have to make a cartoonish shaped hole in the fabric of reality in order to see that another world is possible through it. Or at least that's, I think, our stance on that. Yeah. Oh, stop asking it now. Yeah. Yeah. I love that question, actually. I haven't specifically thought about that before. I really like that question. I think that I agree with you that like death is a intrinsic and fundamental part of life. And in that sense, maybe something we should dig into deeper in future projects. I do think that so I don't know what my stance is on it yet. I do think that like there is, or there can be a bigger gradation between life and death than sometimes we think. And yeah, ultimately something's dead. Like, but I think there is gradations in between of different kinds of liveliness that sometimes, again, a sort of biological standpoint doesn't allow us to appreciate. And in that sense, it would be really, I think, like as the needle starts going towards death, like what does that mean for a lively architecture? I don't know if I know the answer to that yet, but I'm really intrigued by the question. I mean, I think that, again, so often we're working in contexts of existing buildings or in a kind of broad modality of adaptive reuse. And so I think there's a question of like, where did some like initial identity of a component of the built environment, like where did it start? Where did it end? Is it still like when we do a gut rehab, like how much death was actually involved in that process, in that demo plan that I showed you? I think quite a bit actually. But I don't think we like fully killed the original building either. So I don't know. This is a really inarticulate answer, but I really appreciate the question. I'll get back to you. Yeah. Yeah. We can go back to any of them. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly like the evidence, I think the evidence of life can be really different in the context of a drawing where, I mean, I think for me, the most powerful part or the most powerful difference between a drawing of architecture and architecture delivered as a sort of built thing in the world, I think they're equally architecture. But I think the biggest difference for me is that the drawing necessarily has a narrative frame around it. And therefore, it somehow, and again, I think this is true in the history of architecture, because of the narrative frame, that is, we know it's a drawing, we know it's something that exists within the imaginary world and creative possibilities of the practice of drawing. I think it's easier for people to suspend their disbelief that architecture can be alive. So I think it's easier. I think drawings have a sort of advantage in that way because they have a narrative frame. And I think, honestly, I think the hardest part for me about being an architect is that, and oftentimes it goes back to your question, why we often have to sort of, I don't want to say resort to, but why we indulge in sort of bright colors and shapely forms is that when we're in the more kind of normative spaces of everyday life, there's no narrative frame. It's all around us. It is the real. Because it's all around us all the time, unless you're in a sort of great work of architecture with a capital A, which is, I would say, a minority of spaces in the world, at least according to us snobby architects, it's easy to forget that there was actually imagination and a sort of ideology, a narrative, like that there is some kind of idea that underpins a space. And I do believe that even if a space isn't designed by an architect, or even if it is, but it's just kind of normative and not considered a great work of architecture in our architecture textbooks, that it's still alive and that it still has ideas that underpin it and ideas that also propel it. And so I guess just to get back to your question, I think the tricky part I think the liability that we have as architects is it's easy to take for granted from a broad public that architecture has just as much sort of cultural imagination behind it as does, say, film, as does seeing art in a gallery, of going to the theater and seeing a show through a proscenium, that is this narrative frame where we're able to enter another world where anything is possible. And architecture I think, has a liability around that. And so I think, and I think ultimately this is why I think in my practice we've been more interested in sort of seeking out opportunities that result in built works that are inhabited and that have like programmed connections to communities than we are in making drawings, although I love making drawings, because we're interested in kind of challenging that and helping use the interventions that we have in the world, again, which until this point have been, for the most part, in the realm of interior architecture and also in sort of public spaces that are entangled in the messiness of the world, like ways of sort of punching these cartoon-shaped holes into reality. Or another way of saying that is inserting our own narrative frame into the world when sometimes it's not always visible. I don't know, does that answer your question? Yeah, you're in the back, so does that mean you're an interior architect? No, not at all. I'm sorry, I can't see you. Yes. Yeah. I love that question. So actually, I think one of the things I struggle with in my practice, and I'm trying to, maybe this is good to stop on. One of the things I struggle with is I feel like in the English language, we don't have a good word for what's like in between temporary and permanent without just making modifiers of those two words. So we have semi-permanent or whatever, but that has no oomph. That has no verb. Like, I wish I struggle with this because I don't think anything is permanent. Nothing is permanent. Like, we live in a world where for both violent and just natural reasons, like things are always changing, things are degrading, things are destroyed, and things also, lifespans change sometimes prematurely because of how much maintenance and love we put into things too. So nothing's permanent. At the same time, I'm super suspicious of like purely temporary architecture So I really appreciate your observation, because it's exactly, you got it exactly right, that we are interested in elevating things that seem like they might be temporary and giving them a much longer life. That, again, I would love a more oomphy word than semi-permanent. I mean, I think the best word I've come up with so far is that we're interested in what I would call continual impermanence, which is to say, we want to make work that's aware of the fact that it's impermanent, but also really invested and crafted ultimately in a way that can have a long-term use. And in convincing people of that, like in some ways, like this project, for instance, it's not part of the base building of this fancy building, but our key attribute in bringing this in the world was to convince the university's committee of design that has to approve all projects on campus that this should be, for lack of a better word, a permanent installation. And ultimately we did. But I'm digressing. Well, your original question was, I think it just factors in the design process, in that it has to be an intentional part of the design process. And like that architecture festival that we created in North Lawndale, like our sort of mantra to the designers that we commissioned to be part of it is like the second life of the project actually is the first life of the project. Which is to say that, like, thinking about how this thing has a kind of long-term program use in the community is in fact the first priority, even though that's not the first chronological enactment. And I think, and that's like a more explicit example, because that's like literally the whole goal of the project. But I think in our other projects, we're always interested in trying to think about, even if we're working through the guise of public art, which has been, I will say, convenient for us at times, because you can get away with more stuff when it's art instead of when it's architecture, which we kind of quickly learned. And so that's been like a convenient guise or a loophole to play. But like, as with the case with the sort of project in Columbus, like finding ways to also build a craft and durability into the process and make something that seems like it could only exist as an art installation actually have a much entangled set of relationships with the community. So I think it's really about building the relationships as much as the architecture. And again, to use your lecture series word, the entanglements that are required to make that possible. Oh, we're back to the death question. I don't know that I have a great answer for that yet. I mean, I think, and it's clearly something, now that's the second time it's come up, something we should probably be thinking more about. I mean, we certainly, I think there's like a kind of, there is like, I guess like the ecological question of like, when the time comes that this thing, that this building doesn't exist anymore. How does this material re-enter a kind of ecological, like life cycle of decay and decomposition? So there's that question, which frankly, I don't think we addressed well in this project at all. I think that's like one part of that question, which we do think about in some projects, although again, I don't think we did a good job of that in this project. But I think there's like, I think maybe why the reason I have trouble answering this question is because because so much of our efforts go around trying to like create the relationships and entanglements and second and third lives and like scenarios of possible reuse. And moreover, the like scenarios of love, where we actually just hope, like for us, a sort of more than like using the most sustainable material, I think like our like approach to sustainability is producing something that people love enough that they'll want to keep around and that they'll want to inject new life in that we can't predict or that we can't design, which I think absolutely deserves a kind of ecological critique, but has been our approach to date of thinking about this, about love, which frankly I think is a word that we don't use enough in architecture and design school, as a goal for the work. Yeah. I mean, I think that, are you thinking of like this project specifically, or? I think in general, the idea that there's a process of degradation that it creates a patina. Yeah. It's a different kind of life. Yeah, and that's absolutely true, and I think that's something that many scores of architects have, I think, delighted in across time, right? That one, I think, slightly more obvious attribute of the fact that all architecture is alive is that materials are constantly in a state of change. And some materials give us a more exaggerated or an accelerated vision of that. I think probably the material we use, I didn't show a good project of it, I think, tonight, but we use a lot of cedar for outdoor kinds of installations, and certainly like the project in Columbus is made out of cedar, and like, you know, that changes color pretty rapidly in the, you know, in a 5-year time period, from, especially when we choose like the brightest, reddest one we can find, and it'll turn gray pretty fast. And that's, I think, a fantastic and like literally more surface level. And I don't say surface level in a sense that it's less valuable or less important, but surface level in that it's literally on the surface as something that we can encounter to remind us that these things are changing. These things are alive. Our hair is graying. The cedar is graying. This is not an accident. So it's not something we have necessarily spent a long time like talking about in the context of our work, but I think is quintessential. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that. I think to your question, that it's very much a question about scale and not so much a question about size. Like, I think there can be a giant companionable architecture. I think it's really about the context and environs in which it sits, and if that, you know, and there's absolutely an urban context in which a kind of giant companion makes sense. I think we. I don't know if I'll be able to pull it up quick enough, but we, actually the first project we ever did in our practice was before we had our first client. Hopefully I have this on our website back from the olden days. This loads. Was a children's book, and we entered it into the fairy tales competition. I don't know if this will load, so maybe not. But oh, here it is actually. And so we wrote this children's book that is this kind of fairy tale to architecture, and some of the little snippets of it were in the thumbnails in the lecture. But the premise of the story is that you know, there's this little 4-year-old kid who on his 4-month birthday gets these 4 strange architectural companions, and as the kid grows up, the companions grow too, but at an exponential rate compared to the human body. And so quickly, although they started out sort of as toys and kind of furnishings, they quickly start to become the rooms of his house. And you know, this is just some small excerpts of it, but ultimately they become the buildings in his city when he's an old man. And this is maybe like a slightly cheeky kind of example of it, but I don't think it's any question of size. I think it is a question of scale and the relationship to context, which is one of the many ways we build relationships, which is about what companionship is all about. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure to spend the day here. Really inspired by the school's work, and hope to keep in touch with you all. Thank you so much for coming.